Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the online Q&A about the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team. We have attendees logging in now, so we'll give everybody just a minute to get into the GoToWebinar platform here. Really glad to have you today. Looking forward to having this conversation. This is actually the second one we've done today. We did our first ever online Q&A earlier this morning, and it worked great. We have a list of questions that you all and others have submitted, and then during the time together today on the GoTo platform, we can actually have you ask additional questions as well as we go. I will, as I answer questions that you've submitted, I will try to give a little break and take a look and see if anybody has entered another question. After all, this is all about answering your questions. It's a pretty cool little way to do things. Historically, we do these webinars where it's presentation slides and telling all the wonderful things that we think you'd want to know about the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team. But this, in this format, I get to answer your questions, which is a whole lot of fun for me. So to test the online question functionality, do me a favor, and on your GoToWebinar control panel, find that Questions tab and enter in the location that you are calling in from today. We'll just get you familiar with that question tab and see if it's working. So there you go. Tracy's in Seattle. I noticed we have a bunch of people from Seattle that registered. A bunch of King County and government folks. Darcy in Olympia. There we go. Good. Good. So become familiar with that question box there, because again, if you have any questions that pop up based on something that you forgot to ask as we came up to this, or if I say something or something just pops in your mind, go ahead and ask a question. Like I said, I'll keep my eye on that as best I can. So quick, why this approach? We get a lot of questions about the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team, and we do our best to answer these things with our web and our blogs and our social media, but really wanted to use this opportunity to ask your specific questions and give you the direct feedback. So that's what we're going to do. So I have the list of questions here, and I'm just going to go through these things and give you all some feedback and some understanding of how we would answer those as if we were in a one-on-one conversation. So the very first question that I think we want to address is, what is the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team? I like to position it as 2 things. First of all, it's a process for an intact team to go through to be the best that a team can be, but it's also a common language for an organization around teamwork. So as we go through the questions today, you'll learn a little bit more about both the process for a team, the assessment that is associated with it, as well as how do we use this to build a common language, a framework for teamwork in an organization. You should know that all of this is based on this book right here, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. This was published in 2002, and it's been a bestseller pretty much ever since it was published. Now, we've been using concepts from the book for team development for a number of years, but we have found that while The 5 Dysfunctions is a great name for a book, right? It's a little racy and sells books. It's not a great name for a development program. We found that when we start working with teams, that they don't really want to talk about their dysfunctions. Team members would rather talk about the behaviors, the healthy behaviors. What can we do to improve? So a couple of years ago, Wiley Publishing, who is the publisher for the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and Patrick Lencioni and a number of our consulting partners got together and developed this program, which is now called the 5 Behaviors of a Cohesive Team. So that's what the 5 Behaviors of a Cohesive Team is. Now, there's another related question here that asks, what are the 5 behaviors? So what is that framework? And I'll be happy to walk you through that at a high level based on some of the questions that you all asked. I'm assuming that many of you are familiar with this, but it's always good to get a little overview. So if we think about teams, and the whole point of teams is to achieve the common goals that we've come together to achieve, the 5 behaviors essentially provides a framework that allows us to do that. And the first behavior is trust. Now, the trust that we're talking about here is vulnerability-based trust. Now, that's counter to predictable trust or predictability trust. If we have predictability trust, that means, hey, I know what you're going to do based on past experience with you. Vulnerability trust is a little bit different. Vulnerability-based trust is really about having a connection with each other to the point where I'm comfortable saying, hey, I made a mistake, I need some help, or even I'm sorry. And the reason that's the first behavior, it's the foundation. If you look at any of the content from the program, you'll see it's all put together as a pyramid. And trust is down here in that foundational spot. The reason that that's at the foundation is that all the other behaviors are built upon that foundation of vulnerability-based trust. So once a team builds some vulnerability-based trust, the next behavior then that it can focus on is conflict. Now what we're talking about here is healthy conflict, productive conflict around ideas. We're not talking about fighting and name calling and that kind of conflict. We're talking about how do we make sure that the team gets all of its ideas out on the table so we can discuss the merit of those ideas. And obviously the reason that we do the trust first is that if we can believe in each other, if we can trust in each other, and we can not be afraid to share our ideas, then that conflict works that much better. Once we get the team engaged in that healthy conflict, that productive conflict around ideas, well, then we can get to the third behavior, which is commitment to decisions. Now, there's a saying, a philosophy that says that people need to weigh in before they can buy in. And that's what the conflict does. We get the conflict around ideas, get all the ideas out on the table. Then when we ask the team to commit to a decision, we can then have everybody buy into that decision, even if the decision that we end up making isn't the one that you might have been arguing for, because you've had your voice heard. Now, in commitment to decisions, there's a very important aspect to this, and that's about establishing clarity. This is where scorecards and dashboards and visual management, all that kind of stuff comes in. Because if we do that well and we get the team to commit to a decision, then we can go to the fourth behavior, which is accountability. Now, it's important to recognize that there are really 3 types of accountability. There's self-accountability, which is essentially saying, hey, I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do. There's leader or manager-led accountability, which is pretty wide-ranging, right? That managers not only need to hold accountable for results, but also attitude and adhering to organizational norms and all kinds of things. But what we're talking about here is the third type of accountability, peer-to-peer accountability. And the reason that that commitment to decisions comes first is that if we have been really clear on identifying what is it that we've committed to as a team, then it's possible for peers on a team to hold each other accountable. For example, if I were to say, hey, Samantha, last week we agreed that you and I need to put this report together and we need to send it to Tammy on Friday. Well, I can't do my part until you give me your data. You said you were going to have that to me by the end of the day today. How are you coming along on that? That's a small example of how do you do peer-to-peer accountability. When you get the team driving towards that level of peer-to-peer accountability, then we can achieve and focus on that last behavior, which is a focus on collective results. Now, you might say, well, if we're not focused on collective results, what will we be focused on? Well, on a lot of teams, personal things get in the way, ego, or it's more important to get credit for what you've done than getting helping the team as a whole focus on its collective results. But what we find is that if you build that trust and then work through those other 4 behaviors, that ultimately the team's going to be in a much better position to focus on those collective results. So let me give a hold up there just a little bit and see if that's generated any questions. If you want to use your question box, feel free. I am going to go ahead and proceed and keep an eye on that. Next question that I have here is, what results have other teams generated with the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team. So what I'm going to do is, after this broadcast, I'll send out some case studies to all of you as a follow-up to give you some more detail. But I'll just touch on a couple of scenarios that we've experienced that have been pretty powerful. For those of you up in Washington, we have one of the government agencies we've been working with up there that began this process about a year ago, and they started the 5 behaviors process really to address the issue of employee engagement. Scores weren't where the director and the team wanted them to be, and over the previous years they've been doing some of the lean improvement work and working on metrics, and while there were some good results from that work, they found that it wasn't really making good impact on the employee engagement score. So they started with the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team, and as they worked through that, over the course of just 1 year, employee engagement scores rose by 33%. Pretty powerful. There's a health system. That used the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team that experienced some very similar kinds of jumps in employee engagement scores. They got their employee engagement scores up into the 80s and 90s. There's another result that they had that was pretty powerful. You see, they are one division in a overall health system, and each division in that health system measures customer satisfaction. Well, the division that used the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team, their customer satisfaction scores are the highest in the division. And if you talk to the director in that group, she will attribute that customer satisfaction result to the fact that the team is working more effectively together, is committed to decisions, and is focused on those shared results. We had a utility firm that has taken the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team and actually blended it into their Greenbelt training. You see, when we do the Greenbelt training, we work on Greenbelt projects, it's all about teamwork, right? But there's oftentimes when we focus just on the hard tools, the hard skills of Lean Six Sigma, that the projects stall because these team members don't really know how to work well together. So we've blended in some concepts from the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team, and what that's done is it's enabled those Greenbelt teams, those Lean Six Sigma teams, to actually generate faster, better results on those projects. And just the last little example that I'll share with you is there's a major technology company up in Washington that went through the 5 behaviors process across several teams, and the thing that they noticed was silos, departmental silos started to fall. If you talk to the team there, they will tell you that they are now better able to communicate with each other across departments because each team has more clarity around its goals and priorities, and that has enabled them to break down some of those silos. Like I said, I will send out some case studies to all of you. That'll give you a little more detail on those programs there. So the next question is generally, why do we find that this approach is better than, or how does it compare with other team development programs that might be out there? Someone asked a question about speed of trust, for example, which of course is Covey's program, great program, all about building trust. Well, to answer that, I'll mention that when we started Integris in 2011, we wanted to make sure that we were offering programs that were going to influence organizational culture over the long term. Specifically, we wanted to avoid anything that could be viewed as flavor of the month. And I'll be the first to say that there are a ton of great skill-building programs out there. Programs like Speed of Trust, like Crucial Conversations, like Situational Leadership, they are wonderful skills that any team and any leader really should know how to embrace. I would argue that the difference between the 5 behaviors and those other programs is that it provides a framework and a common language that everyone on the team and everyone in the organization can lock onto. Think about this. How many training programs or courses have you gone to over the last several years where you really enjoy the content as you're going through it, but then say 6 months later, you can't really remember what exactly went on in there? That doesn't happen with the 5 behaviors because of this structure of trust and conflict and commitment and accountability and results, and that being the framework, that really establishes this language that really can stick with an organization for years to come. So our suggestion is that you use the 5 behaviors to establish that framework for how the teams are going to work in your organization. Then you use all of those other programs, the Crucial Conversations, Speed of Trust, all of those great programs to bring even more robustness to how the team builds trust, enables conflict, commits to decisions, things like that. Okay, so next question goes a little bit into the assessment itself. Now, there is a team assessment. Here's a copy of the report. I'm getting a 40-page report that is chock full of information that a team can use over the long term. But what's on this assessment is really 3 types of questions. The first 2 types are about the team. There are questions about how are we doing now as a team and what can we do to improve. And the assessment is sent online anonymously to every team member on the team, and they're asked to answer these questions of how are we doing now and what can we do to improve. And that's all of those answers are then shared in that report, again, without names associated with them. And then there's a third type of question, which is around your personality preference. There are actually 2 types of personality tools that we use. One is DISC and one is Mbti compatible. I'll get to those in a second. But essentially what we do with that personality style, that personality preference, is that for each one of the behaviors, of those 5 behaviors, when we are working with the team and we are dissecting the team's feelings on how are we doing now and what can we do to improve, we bring in the team's various personality styles to basically have a discussion around, okay, how do these personality styles impact our ability to have conflict, to hold each other accountable. The argument there, of course, is that depending on what kind of a person you are and what some of your preferences are, you're going to engage in those behaviors very differently. For example, in conflict, if you are a D or just an A-type driver-type personality, you're probably going to come at conflict in a little bit more of a robust way than somebody who is more of a introverted type person. And by getting those ideas out on the table and by helping the team recognize what everybody's different personality style is, we can get some of those concerns on the table, and we can help people either tone down some of their unhealthy behaviors that they're natural to do, or step up some of their communication so that they're just that much more effective. Now, one of the other really important things for you to know about this team assessment is it's not a one and done assessment. Once you take the team assessment with your team, you have access to unlimited progress reports. That means that every 4 months, every 6 months, the same intact team can answer essentially those same questions. How are we doing, and what do we need to do to improve? You don't have to answer the personality questions. Again, of course, we don't expect that your personality is going to change that quickly, but we do provide that kind of ongoing measurement of how the team is doing. Here's an image of one of those progress reports, and you can see on one side it shows the original scores that you received, the team gave themselves last time, and then it shows you the scores that you received this time. Great way to baseline and to measure what kind of progress you're making, and enables you to then set forth the plan for the next 4 or 6 months on what we can do. Now, there's a related question to that came in on the personality styles, and somebody asked, should we be choosing the everything DISC version, or should we be choosing the MBTI compatible version of the assessment? Now, the first answer I would give you is, well, is your organization already using one or the other? Because if you are, then of course your answer is easy. If you already have a language around DISC or a language around MBTI, that's what you're going to want to use. But if not, then we can give you some guidance. We tend to find that the Everything DISC tool actually works better for teams that are trying to build more cohesion, and they're not looking to do a whole lot of investment in the personality tool itself. The reason is this: MBTI, for those of you who have taken the Myers-Briggs type indicator, you know that it gives you all kinds of great insights as to what drives you, what motivates you, how do you act in different situations. But what it doesn't provide, that DISC provides, is it doesn't allow you to interact with people quite the same way. So if we aren't really investing a whole lot of time and effort in helping people understand their MBTI style, then it's going to be really hard for them to remember their own style and then remember how their style interacts with others. With Everything DISC, the framework is much more simple. It's not simplistic, but it's much more simple, and it's highly effective in identifying what are your kind of behavioral preferences. So with DISC, if you're a D or a I, which stands for influencer, I can make some good assumptions around how you might receive my communication. The other thing with everything DISC that's blended into the 5 behaviors report is you can get access to things that we call comparison reports, which allows anybody on the team to develop a comparison report with somebody else, which shows, hey, here's your style, here's my style, and here's some ways that we would likely interact as we're working together. So that's a really powerful tool there. So again, I will point you to the question box on your control panel. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I will go ahead and proceed. The next question is, how can we actively use these 5 behaviors within our teams to benefit our organization? Obviously, that's the million-dollar question, right? There's a couple of ways to do this. As I mentioned in the beginning, when I explained what is the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team, I mentioned that it's a process for intact teams as well as a common language for the organization. If we think about how you can actively use the 5 behaviors in your organization, I have 3 ideas for you. One would be to share the language with everyone in the organization. Do some lunch and learns, do some general education, get everyone aligned around the idea that if you're working on a team or if you're working in this organization, in order to get to those shared results, we want to build that trust, we want to enable healthy conflict, we want to make sure we're committing to the decisions and we're holding each other accountable. And if you do that, then all of a sudden there starts to become a little bit of pressure on individual teams and individual players to adhere to that. The next idea would be to have everyone in your organization use whatever your chosen personality preference instrument is, whether it's DISC or Mbti or any of the other great ones out there. Those tools on their own are a great vehicle for helping people understand how to communicate, how to build trust, and how to have that more healthy conflict. And then that brings me to the third and most specific way that you can use the 5 behaviors within your team at the organization. And that, of course, is to use the team assessment with your intact teams. What we find is if you start with the management team, the executive team, that's the best place to start, because that not only gives the management team the opportunity to improve, right, and get clearer on their decisions and start holding each other accountable in a better, more effective way, but it also sets the tone for the rest of the organization. Because after all, if the executive team does it and they say, hey, this worked for us, it provides credibility to the overall program. Now, there's a question here about how does the 5 behaviors process support the interdependencies across departments beyond just the formal teams, but with all the matrix organizations that are involved now, how does it actually help an organization build those interdependencies? And it goes back to that comment that I made about common language. In some ways, I like to use a American football team analogy, in that an American football team has 53 people on the team, and that's a team. But if you think about it, there are sub-teams on that American football team, right? You have the offensive team, which is about 25 people. Then you have the starting team, which is 11 people. Then you have the front line, those guys that hike the ball and block for the runners. That's 6 or 7 guys, and that's an intact team. So what I would argue is that the way that the 5 behaviors language helps support interdependencies is that when the entire team has that language of the 5 behaviors, they can interact, they can support each other, and then as you go down deeper to a more intact team, then you can really get even more deep into each one of those behaviors. Now, certainly some behaviors are more relevant to the larger group than others, like trust and conflict. That really applies to everyone. But when you start getting into the commitment and the focusing on shared results, obviously the intact teams are going to have their own goals that they're going to focus on. I had to laugh a little bit when I got this question, which said, my organization is filled with engineers and they don't like touchy-feely activities. how can we get them to embrace this process? And that is something that I really love about this program. For those of you that are familiar with Integris, you know that we have a strong background in Lean Six Sigma and operational excellence. And in fact, before starting Integris, my partners and I, for 10 years, worked in the Lean Six Sigma field. So we're not all about the touchy-feely stuff. But what I love about the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team program is that it's not just about the soft stuff. We talk about trust and we work on conflict, not as an end goal of its own, but we talk about those things and we build the team's ability to trust and have conflict so that we are better able to commit to decisions and hold each other accountable. So to the person who asked this question about the organization being filled with engineers, I will tell you that we have had great success with this program because we focused on letting them know that this program isn't about just building trust and conflict. Hey, this is about results, and this is about accountability. And the way we get there is by touching on some of these interpersonal communication things. The next question has to do with management teams. And the question specifically was, how can I get my management team to hold each other accountable? Well, remember that the structure of the model is a pyramid, right? And so the idea is you work on the behavior below to enable the behavior above. So to the person who asked this question around how do I get my management team to hold each other accountable, first you got to focus on commitment. And most importantly there, you need to get the clarity around what it is that you want to achieve. Because if you've identified the goal, you've identified a measure of success, you've identified a time frame, you've identified roles and responsibilities, that's what sets you up then for holding each other accountable. Remember, we're talking about peer-to-peer accountability, and quite honestly, it's a little bit of an awkward kind of a thing, right, to expect peers on a team to hold each other accountable. Most people say, hey, that's not my job, that's the manager's job. But again, if we focus on that commitment, if we get that clarity, if we get that visual management going in or those goals, then it's really easy to say, hey, Tom, we agreed that this is the role you were going to play. This was due to me yesterday. What happened with it? Or this is due tomorrow. What's going on with it? So it makes the peer-to-peer accountability process actually a lot easier by focusing on that commitment. If you don't have that commitment, just as an aside, if you don't have that clarity, then of course it's really impossible for peers to hold each other accountable, because what are you going to hold each other accountable to? So that's the answer there. A related question was, what metrics should we use to track our success? Now, the first answer I would give you is that the metrics associated with the decisions that you make as part of commitment are the #1 metrics that you should be using, right? Those are the goals of the organization, or those are the goals of the team. The ultimate measure of success is obtaining those results you set out to achieve. So that's the financial results, the business results, the customer satisfaction, the employee engagement scores, all of those kinds of things. But there is a second measure that, if you go down this path of using the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team, that you can embrace, and that's this team assessment. Remember, I mentioned this progress report. Again, this is something that you can use every 4 or 6 months. Heck, you could use it every week if you wanted to. That'd be a little bit overkill. But the idea is the progress reports are free. So once a team takes it, you can use that to measure the health of a team as frequently as you'd like to do. So we have a lot of teams that do this, where they set a plan and say, hey, look, every 6 months we're going to get together for half a day, and we're going to take the assessment again, and we're going to find out where we are, and we're going to set a new path to move forward. So I will pause there for just a second to see if there's any questions, new questions that have come up. Nothing that has come in on that, but there is a question here that says, we finally built up enough trust for constructive debate to take place, but it seems we need to focus on shared results before commitment and accountability can happen. Is that typical? Now, it's important to remember that these concepts are certainly interconnected. And remember that during commitment, that's where we identify what those shared results we want are. It's during collective results that we help people make sure that we are focusing on those results rather than being distracted by other priorities like taking credit or working on their own projects. So to this question, if you've built up the trust and you're able to have that constructive, healthy conflict, take that next step and write down, what are you committing to? Who is responsible for what? Put some dates to it. Then that presents the target for the shared results, and then try to move into accountability. There's a question here about virtual teams, and the question specifically is, please describe how the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team support us, because we are a highly virtual team. You know, more and more these days, right, we're calling in, we're having remote teams. This is actually very relevant for us here at Integris, because we are a remote team. We have team members all around the country. And I would argue that the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team is potentially even more important for a virtual team than a physical team, a team that's physically together, because in a virtual team, you don't have the luxury of regular face-to-face interactions. So a lot of this, you know, getting to know, this building trust, this getting to understand our styles is a little more difficult when all we do is talk business when we're on the phone or we're on our web chats. So by embracing this framework and by intentionally discussing these behaviors, you're able to help the team make that conscious effort towards becoming more effective in your communications and more effective and more deliberate in building trust, in enabling conflict, and discussing those. This really highlights the point that without a construct like this, whether it's the 5 behaviors or it's some other construct, without some kind of a construct, teams don't typically talk about these things, right? I mean, I look back at my career, you know, before getting into this business, and I never had a team member come up to me and say, so, how do you like to engage in conflict, right? It just doesn't happen. It's not the way we naturally speak with each other. But if you, as a team, make an intentional decision to say, we're going to improve how we work together as a team, and we're going to have some conversations that are maybe a little bit awkward and a little bit difficult, that's when you start to have some of these breakthroughs, because you learn things about each other and you learn things about yourself that really bear out in how effective the team is going to be. Well, we got a question here that says, when new team members come on board partway through the process, how do we bring them up to speed? It's an excellent question, Jennifer. Thanks for asking it. So there are a few ways to do it. First and foremost, we hope that once the team and the organization has started to use the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team, you start to blend some of that language into your everyday interactions. For example, we have teams that now during their onboarding process for new hires, they talk about, here's how we act as a team. More and more organizations are talking about organizational culture during onboarding, and that's just a piece of it, right? This 5 behaviors. The other thing that we can do is that we, of course, want to add them into the team assessment. Now, I mentioned those progress reports. So if you have a team that's already done a team assessment, may even taken a progress report, you can actually add the new team member into the next progress report, and you don't have to buy new assessments for all the team members. You only have to buy a new assessment for that one person, and then we, on our end, put that person into the team, the intact team that's already there, and so the next time that you all take the assessment, their results are blended in with the rest of the team. So those are a couple of ideas. If that answers it, Jennifer, let me know, and if you have a follow-on question, feel free to enter it in. I'll keep an eye on the point there. Another question came in was, so who is Integris and how does the 5 behaviors fit into what we do? I guess I didn't really cover that at the beginning. So we're a consulting and training organization, and everything we do is focused on building healthy organizations and great places to work. The history, we started this company in 2011, and the history of our team prior to that is my partners and several of our consultant team members all worked together for about 10 years doing Lean Six Sigma efforts. And that's when we, as I was mentioning a little bit earlier, we were doing these great projects, generating great results, but the culture of the organization really wasn't changing. So we recognize if we really want to get out of just doing projects and we want to get into the culture building, the culture evolution business, we really need to have solutions for team dynamics and leadership behaviors as well. Because after all, if we're going to help an organization achieve the big goals, right, the business results, the customer satisfaction results, the employee engagement results, we can't be focused just on operational excellence. We got to make sure that we're incorporating the individual leadership behaviors and those team dynamics. So for us, the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team forms that foundation, that framework for how a team should act. On the individual leadership behaviors side, we use a methodology that I know many of you on this call are familiar with called the Leadership Challenge. And on the operational excellence side of things, we of course use Lean and Lean Six Sigma. So that's a little bit about us. The next question actually connects with the Leadership Challenge, because the question asks, we've already been using the Leadership Challenge with our leadership team. Is this something separate, or can the Leadership Challenge work with the 5 behaviors of cohesive team? So to make sure that everybody on the call is up to speed, at least has a basic understanding, the Leadership Challenge is a widely used, widely credible leadership framework that's used by about 3 million people around the world. It's all based on 30 years of research by Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner, all about what do leaders do when they're at their leadership best. And the summary of the framework is that leaders, when they're at their best, do 5 specific practices. They model the way, they inspire a shared vision, they challenge the process, they enable others to act, and they encourage the heart. And how that blends then with the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team is that really it's 2 sides of the same coin. Because when we do this work with 5 behaviors of a cohesive team, we of course are focused on the team as a whole, but really there's always going to be a team leader. And the team leader always plays a really important role in anything that happens with the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team. So if your leader, your team leader, has already gone through this process, to the person who asked this question, if your leader has already gone through the process of the Leadership Challenge and they are working on their own ability to be a good role model, to inspire that shared vision, to challenge the process, to enable others, and to encourage others, then the elements of the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team are going to be very natural for them, and they're going to fit into what they're doing. And I would argue, based on what we've seen, that team leaders who have a good foundation in individual leadership, they are more likely to put some pressure on the team, gentle pressure to push the team to say, hey, we can get better, we can do more, and let's embrace these behaviors. It's interesting, when we first started working with the 5 behaviors, it really wasn't designed by the authors to link with the Leadership Challenge, but it just turns out that the 2 of them really are 2 sides of the same coin. So if you are using the Leadership Challenge, I highly encourage you, go ahead and use the 5 behaviors, bring that into the team. This last set of questions, so we're getting to the end here, so if you do have any other questions, let me know through that question box. But there are 3 questions here that I think I'm going to group together. They're kind of related. One is, do I need to hire Integris to facilitate a team intervention, or can we use the assessment on our own? Or can we use it without consulting support? The answer is absolutely you can. You do not need to have us, but I'll clarify that in a second, because there's 2 other questions that ask, how can I as a team leader learn to guide my team through the process? And what will I experience if I go through the Facilitation Accreditation program that we offer? So all 3 of those questions really go to the same core question, which is, how do you build the capability internal to your team, internal to your organization, to guide a team through this process? As you might imagine, when a team starts talking about trust and talking about conflict, some emotions can fly, and that's really by design, because after all, trust and conflict and getting a commitment, these are emotional things. We are emotional creatures. So the best process that we've seen to get up to speed is to go through this Facilitation Accreditation program that we've worked with Wiley Publishing to develop. It's a 2-day program that basically teaches you everything you need to know about the assessment and teaches you all the activities that we would take a team through as we are working to improve these activities. Now, it's real important to recognize that these team sessions really aren't training sessions. They're really facilitated negotiations or facilitated discussions, because that team assessment, what it tells you is, because you ask the team members, how are we doing and what can we do to improve? Well, there are some teams that are really struggling with trust, and it comes out in the assessment. There are others that say, like the question earlier, where the question asker said, hey, we've already built some really good trust, now we need to focus on conflict. Well, depending on what your team needs to focus on, you as a facilitator or as a team leader need to be nimble and need to be flexible to those needs. And that's what that facilitation program is all about. If you're interested in that, you can find more information at impactleadershipsummit.com. Our next program is coming up in July. We're going to be in Laguna Beach at a gorgeous retreat venue called The Ranch. And if you're interested in learning activities about mastering those behaviors and learning how to use the assessment, that's really the best thing. I will say that that is not a requirement. So to the very specific question of can you use the assessment on your own without any kind of external support, you absolutely can. We have lots of teams that just acquire the assessment from us and give it out to their team and find out what where you sit. I would argue that if your team is, if you know going in your team is having some really tough trust issues, then you might want to think twice about doing that, simply because this can uncover some pretty raw emotions. But if you already have some trust and you want to measure, how you're doing on commitment and accountability and things like that, some of the more operational kind of activities, I think it's a really good and powerful tool to use. So I am going to stop there, because that's the end of the questions that you all submitted here. So if anyone else has another question, feel free to use that box and enter it in. And if not, I will go ahead and conclude here and thank everybody for being part of this program. Like I said, this is just the second time we've done this kind of a program with an online Q&A. I hope it was something that was helpful. We do a lot of webinars and webcasts where we're doing a kind of a canned presentation, but this is an opportunity to answer your specific questions. So hopefully your question was on this list and you got it answered. And even if it wasn't your question, it gave you some good insights. If you have any other questions, you all have my email address now. Feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call, and we'll be happy to help however I possibly can. So if we're going to go ahead and conclude, I will say thank you very much for attending, and have a great rest of the day. And just a final plug: go Warriors! Sorry, couldn't resist. Take care, everybody.